This is the 5-Minute Podcast Review for Monday, April 30th, 2018, and I've got 5 new podcasts to tell you about, so let's jump right in. First podcast is a new one out called Caliphate. And Caliphate is a high-quality audio documentary by Rukmini Callimachi, who covers terrorism for the New York Times. The series has been put together and recorded over the past year, and it's a deep dive look at who or what is ISIS, how do they actually operate on a day-to-day basis, what draws people to ISIS, and what they're actually fighting for. Caliphate contains the kind of detail you get from sifting through the stuff left behind by ISIS in places where they've been driven out. So abandoned offices, hard drives, documents, the contents of trash cans, and also from talking to ISIS recruits and insiders themselves. The first 2 of a series of 10 episodes are up now, and Caliphate sounds like being a genuinely insightful podcast series, definitely worth checking out, and you can use the link on your screen or just search Caliphate wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, on to 8 Minutes, which is a 5-part Australian podcast. It's just done its run and was one of the most downloaded podcasts in Australia over April. 8 Minutes is another of the now fairly common true crime cold case podcast series. I've looked at least 2 in the past, and there are many more around. 8 Minutes focuses on the mystery of the last 8 minutes of life of 28-year-old David Breckenridge as he left a Sydney hotel with a few beers to walk to a friend's house to watch a late-night international rugby match on TV. David, a guy with apparently no enemies, never made it and was instead found brutally bashed and stabbed to death in a laneway. Now, this all happened back in 2002, and the podcast, true to the form of this style of podcast, introduces a range of twists and apparent new evidence to the story, as well as suggestions of police bungling of the initial investigation. 8 Minutes is produced by Sydney's Daily Telegraph tabloid newspaper and has been strongly supported by spreads in the paper, pushing the story in the podcast and calling on podcast listeners to, quote, help us catch a killer. Anyhow, you probably have a sense of what 8 Minutes is about, and especially if you're into the unsolved crime type genre, you'll probably find the 5 main episodes and the 2 bonus episodes of 8 Minutes worth listening to. Personally, I did listen to all episodes and I found it interesting, partly because I used to work right near where the murder happened and would pretty much walk the route the victim walked every day, though I had no idea of the murder at the time. But I did feel the podcast series dragged things out a bit, maybe a bit too much padding where there was no actual new information, but like I said, if true crime cold case stories are your thing, then give 8 Minutes a go. Next up is Dear HBR. So you may have heard of the HBR Ideacast. I actually reviewed it back in 2016. It's a good podcast from Harvard Business Review that features interviews with leading business and management thinkers on a wide range of topics. Well, Dear HBR is kind of like a companion podcast. You could think of it as an agony aunt podcast for business people and managers. Each episode is hosted by 2 senior HBR editors and often includes input from expert guests. Each episode is themed around a particular issue, so the first 7 episodes currently up deal with the following workplace issues: how to be a first-time boss, office romances, difficult people, generational conflict, pay injustices, career transitions, and bad bosses. The episodes are kicked off with a typical listener question related to the theme, and then the panel work the question over as if it were a Harvard case study question. Now, what I've liked about the episodes I've heard so far is that the panel seem to have a genuine conversation about solutions to the issues, rather than wheeling out stock or politically correct answers. I like this comment, for example, in relation to a question about office romances.
This is what I would do. Actually, I would write her an email.
Helen, wow, I'm surprised. I saw this in some ways as a 2-part question. Question 1, should I pursue? And question 2, how should I pursue? It sounds like the should isn't even a question in your mind. Allison, how did you look at that piece of it?
Well, it's interesting because, and maybe this is sort of our HBR background, I would have first said, well, what are my corporate policies on any of this? Does my company have a policy? He doesn't mention that he's looked at the HR guidelines or any of that. There could be an outright ban on fraternization with clients at his company. I don't know.
The problem with these company policies is that nobody follows them. Bottom line is about 34% of singles actually do feel that the office is a place to meet people. I guess the reason I didn't consider the company policies is, A, they don't seem to be followed anyway, and B, I was thinking of a higher order issue in this guy. I don't think he can stop himself, so I started to think, okay, if he's not going to stop himself, let's think of the safest way to do this.
Okay, so as that clip illustrates, the discussion is based in reality, and from time to time the panelists actually give conflicting advice, but that's how life is. So as a listener, you can process a range of opinions and decide what's the best approach in your particular case. So that's Dear HBR, and you can check it out using the link on your screen. Podcast number 4, another new one, is Great Leap Years. And this series, researched, written and narrated by Stephen Fry, looks at the stories behind the landmark inventions that transformed human history. And a lot of this centres on mass communication technologies, from the Gutenberg press to railroads and the telegraph, through to the internet and the tsunami of information, real and fake, that is engulfing us right now. So Stephen Fry is a great translator of the complex and the scientific for the intelligent everyday person, and this, combined with his very British way with words, makes Great Leap Years as entertaining as it is informative and thought-provoking. I'll play just a minute or so of Stephen Fry's introduction to the series, which I think will give you a good sense of if Great Leap Years is for you or not.
Hello, it's Stephen Fry here. You may not have heard from me for quite a while, in this medium at least, but now a new podcast series from me, tracing revolutions and leaps in discoveries and inventions that have supercharged history, leading up to the big one that is coming soon. The future has already happened. The world is on the very edge of utter transformation, and perhaps the best way of understanding what this might mean is not to peer blindly into the dense fog of the unknown, but to look back and see how we have transformed our world in the past. The saga of the development of technologies that crisscrossed continents, railroad, telegraph, electricity, telephone, radio, television, and internet, is filled with extraordinary stories of human will, coincidence, and inspiration. In a series of podcasts, I will tell some of these stories and show how the world has been changed by a fascinating and astonishing mixture of human decision and vision, greed and need. The cable of history that connects Galvani and Volta to Alexander Graham Bell and Edison is the cable that connects Europe to America, New York to San Francisco, yesterday to today, and most excitingly, today to tomorrow.
Okay, so that's Stephen Fry and Great Leap Years. There's 4 episodes up now. I think the 4th one's just gone up. I haven't heard it yet, but I've enjoyed the grand storytelling style of the first 3 and I'll probably stick with this series. So if it sounds interesting to you, check out Great Leap Years. Okay, a quick one to finish on, Retropod. And each Retropod episode is a bite-sized chunk, usually 2 to 3 minutes, on a moment in modern history, like the history of daylight savings, or how the NRA began, or in recent days, topical episodes like a history of epic North Korean insults and the story of the fracas surrounding a commencement speech made by Barbara Bush as First Lady. Retropod, being daily and short, is designed for the Amazon Echo and Google Home age, where short, informative podcasts are queued or summoned up to play typically at the start of your day, along with the news, weather and traffic information, that sort of thing. But it plays equally well as a regular podcast, and being so short, it's easy to subscribe to and listen to or reject episodes on a daily basis, depending on if the subject catches your interest or not, without too much of a time commitment. So if you want to add Retropod to your podcast pile, the easiest way is to just use the link on your screen. Okay, that's it for this episode where we looked at Caliphate, 8 Minutes, Dear HBR, Great Leap Years and Retropod. Hope you picked up at least a couple of good suggestions in that lot, and I'll see you in the next episode. Thanks for listening.